So the first thing I want to tell you is the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Do you buy that? The church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. The church is, or the world has changed and the church is not. So we will need to recalibrate. We'll need to engage in innovation. But there's a problem with that. If you read the literature, there's an enormous secular literature on innovation. And if you read it, what they will tell you over and over again is that the best way to innovate is to abandon the past. They'll talk about the importance of burning the boats, cut the ties to the past. But Christians can never abandon the past. We are never going to stop reading 2 Corinthians. We're never going to stop saying Jesus is Lord. We cannot abandon the past. So what are we going to do? So here's the question that we're going to work on. How do we maintain a rock-solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel, while at the same time creating innovative and entrepreneurial spirit for how to present that gospel to an ever-changing culture? An unchanging gospel and an ever-changing culture. And that takes us back to recalibrating. If I wanted to reset my watch, if I were to calibrate my watch, what would I do? I would find some kind of standard that I thought was accurate, and I would calibrate my watch to that standard. So what are we going to recalibrate to? What kind of standard are we going to pursue? Well, in this particular case, we have to recognize that we have to have two standards, because we want to be able to have the unchanging gospel and the ever-changing culture. And so what I'm going to propose is that the dual standard that we use for our recalibrating is people and practices. We're going to calibrate according to the longings and losses of the ever-changing people that are trusted to our care. And we are going to calibrate towards the practices that embody and enact the unchanging Christian gospel. And that's the place that we're going to go. And to do that, I'm going to talk about 6 aspects of innovation. I got to tell you, the last half of 4, 5, and 6, we won't spend nearly as much time on. We don't have time. But I'm going to talk about what leadership for innovation looks like. I'm going to talk about a new meaning for innovation. I'm going to talk about the standards that we're going to pursue of people and practices. I'll talk about a process for innovation, specifically a process that combines human-centered design with practical theology. And then we'll talk about different pathways to innovation. And then finally, we'll talk about how to create an environment for innovation, particularly what would it look like to have a congregational culture that supported innovation. So that's the overview of where we're going. We're 5 minutes in, and now you kind of said, okay, I've blown my wad, I've said all the important stuff. You can feel free that if you need to go, that's what I'm going to say. But before I go on, if I really believe leadership skills are listening, I want to start. Are there any comments or questions, even now as we're just 5 minutes in?
I think you have an intercultural innovation.
Excuse me?
Intercultural.
How do you handle intercultural innovation? One of the things that we're going to talk about is that we pay attention to the longings and losses of the ever-changing people that are entrusted to our care. The people that are entrusted to our care are embedded in a culture. And so we'll spend an enormous amount of our time as we listen to those people, listen to the culture that they represent. And so what it would look like to present the gospel to people that are embedded in one culture would absolutely positively have to be different than what it would look like to present that same gospel to a people that are embedded in a different culture. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the people entrusted to our care and the ways in which they are connected to and embedded within their cultures. So yeah, that's great. Anything else? Then let's go on. As I said, the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Now we're used to, as Christians, calibrate. Does that look like a hand up? You look like you were going to say something. No? Okay. We are used to the idea that we calibrate our ministries for the needs of people entrusted to our care. We do youth ministry. We do ministry. You know about MOPS ministry, our mothers and preschoolers. We're comfortable calibrating that. And we recognize that the needs, that those needs are changing as the world changes. But our congregations act as if the climate doesn't change. The mental models that we Christians hold about the rudiments of church, things such as worship, teaching, fellowship, they were formed in the mid-20th century long before massive social changes transformed the meaning of almost every institution in society. The world is changing fast, and we're not keeping up. We're going to need to recalibrate, and that's going to take innovation. To talk about that, though, I think I'd like to give you one overriding example that we'll use throughout our conversation together. The church as we know it is not calibrated for what I'm going to call the smartphone generation. What I mean by that is think back to even 150 years ago. 150 years ago, with the rise of cities in America, one of the things that happened is that American life became divided by location. It used to be that if you lived in a Midwestern town in the 1830s, 1860s, everything happened in one place. But once you lived in the cities, what would happen is you would go to work, and then you would go to church, and you would go to see your friends, and they would be divided. Your different social worlds would be divided by location. As a matter of fact, what ended up happening is that we began to see that those worlds became cut off from each other. And most people that you know think about themselves as living compartmentalized lives. That's kind of the world that was established in the late 19th century. That if you looked in the 1990s, that would be the same way. But pay attention to any group of millennials, any group of people for whom their smartphones are a significant part of their lives. They are not divided by location. Sit and watch a game with a bunch of 20-somethings. They're constantly on their phone, texting with people. They are looking up scores, looking up stats. If you're sitting at a happy hour with a group of young professionals, what you're going to find is that they're going to be involved texting at different points where, thank you. There we go. Let's see, we managed, we rolled with it. So one of the things that you're going to find is that they can carry on 3 or 4 group texts with 3 or 4 different groups in 3 or 4 different places all at once. Their world is not divided by location. But the church still thinks in terms of a world that's divided by location. And so to focus on that, I want to start by talk about a church we're going to call Millennial Church. It's a composite of a number of different churches. But you're going to find that I didn't want to put any one church on parade. It's actually built around one church mostly, but I didn't want to put that one church on parade. And so I'm going to tell you some stories out of that one church. And we're going to talk about how that one church has wanted to recalibrate itself for the smartphone generation and keep shooting itself in the foot. So one of the things that Millennial Church did was that they have a number of their services that they have that are broadcast to multiple sites. They're one of those churches that has a preacher in one site and then they're different sites. And it was a pretty short step for them to then think about, okay, what if we put our services online? So now all the services are online, and they're really pleased with that until they discover that a number of people in their late 20s, early 30s are no longer coming every week because sometimes they would rather just watch it online and then go off and do the things that they're going to do. And this has created quite the buzz within the leadership of the church because they say that it is wrong for people who are to sit at home and watch the service because what they worry is they're not participating in the service, that worship is something you participate in, and to watch it, you become an audience.
And the way that they would describe it is they said, the goal we have is we want to get the young people to go to church. It is a location-based solution. The problem is attendance. Attendance is a location-based category. And what they want is because they see the world in a location-based way, they want these young people to go to church because that's a measure of devotion. You can't really, what is the proxy that we use? What we're looking for is, Dan here, we want him to worship. And the way that we can tell he's worshiping is he's come into the building. And he stands when everybody stands, and he sits when everybody sits. And he may actually sit there with his hands in his pockets when everybody sings. But we're okay with that because he's come to church. That's the proxy that we have accepted for spiritual devotion, is being in this place. But that's only part of the devotion. What they really want at this church is not just for you to come to church, but for you to join a small group. Because the measure of discipleship is going then midweek to a small group. Again, what happens at that small group? Well, we don't really know for sure. But if you physically go and hang out with that small group, we will accept that as devotion. And what they're interested in is the practice of worship, which they take the proxy of you show up to church. And they're interested in the practice of discipleship. And they will take that as a proxy is you show up to a small group. And they live a world that is still location-based. And they want to reach out to the smartphone generation. How would they do that? That's kind of the case study that we'll look at in the time that we talk together about how you might think about recalibrating. Millennial church will need to recalibrate and will require a new strategy for facing social change. But the problem is that the pace of social change is accelerating. There was a time when the church could absorb an initial social change and then wait for things to settle and then adjust. It used to be you could expect that social change happened infrequently enough that it would happen once every 100 years, and then eventually it would be once every generation. But what happened is that large, disruptive, major social change would only happen infrequently enough that the church could stand back and wait, see how everyone adjusted, and then go ahead and figure out what they were going to do. The problem is that the wait and copy strategy will no longer work. Our strategy was, it used to be, we're going to wait, and one of us in this room, every one of us is a congregation, one of us would figure it out. And when the one person figured it out, then we'd all copy that. And that worked great when social change happened slowly. The problem is that now the research says that it's happening even every 7 to 10 years. Think about, 10 years ago. Think about all the social change that's happened since 2007. The large economic disruptive change. The introduction of the iPhone was 2007. I mean, think about the idea of a smartphone and how embedded it is in society now, and that was only 10 years ago. My school, I don't know about your school, but my school still hasn't figured out how to economically adjust to the major social change that happened with the economic recession of 2007. The CFO here is going, oh yeah, we got this wired. So come and talk to me. I'll put my arm around you. I'll explain it all to you. Everything will be fine.
What I'm thinking about is my kids. So I have my two older kids were graduating from high school in 05 and 08. And the youngest one was a class of 13. And he, when he was in high school, he would start using Twitter. And so, what are you doing? Using Facebook. I'm the Twitter generation.
Yes. Well, so you have kids that graduated in 05, 06, and then 13.
Yeah.
I would argue that they graduated in different worlds.
I agree.
But we're used to, as the church, we have a whole generation to respond. If we had more time, I could go back to 2000 and list for you all the changes that have been disruptive changes just since 2000.
We have
And
a question also online. Will you
Oh,
say
good.
where do you get this data? As you're talking
Sure.
about, where could they go find more if they wanted to?
There's the best place on what I just described was from a book by Thomas Friedman called Thank You for Being Late. Thank You for Being Late? And the second chapter of the book is called What the Hell Happened in 2007? And it's one of those chapters that as I was reading it, I ran out of room in the margins to write notes, and I had to start sticking sticky notes on it because I had so many places where I was interacting with it, because so many of the things that they were talking about were creating the kinds of questions that we in the church have to address. So we cannot wait for things to settle down. But part of the problem is that the millennial church is still, that one congregation that we're going to look on, it's still not only working on the wait and copy strategy, they've been looking at what we might call the change and freeze strategy. A generation or so ago, they adopted what they call the seeker-sensitive church. We're going to recalibrate church for people who are new to the faith or maybe even don't even know the faith. And we're going to make worship services all about answering questions for those kinds of people. And then small groups that's where we're going to do discipleship in depth. And that's great. And they did that in the 1990s, and they assumed they would never have to change again. And much of their inability to respond to the smartphone generation is because they're trying to preserve the last innovation. We would like to think that the people that are innovative will continue to be innovative. But what tends to happen is we become innovative, we find something we like, and we latch onto it, and then we just are the last ones to ever want to change again. So what I would like to do is talk to you about the conversations we're going to have the rest of our time are about helping, what would we do if we were going to help millennial church respond to the smartphone generation. And the first thing I want to talk about is a different model for thinking about leadership. Christian leadership, as we practice it, is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Each of us calibrates our actions to the world around us. If we think the world is predictable, we establish fixed routines, hoping to create guaranteed outcomes, which makes leading a church like operating an assembly line. But the church is not predictable. Excuse me, the world is not predictable. We will need to think more like farmers. Farmers calibrate their efforts around the seasons of the year. They know to expect that spring will bring rain, summer will bring sunshine. But farmers have calibrated themselves to know that what they can and they cannot do. They can't calculate how much rain, how much sunshine. So in my mind, one short verse summarizes all of Christian leadership. And that's 1 Corinthians 3:6. 1 Corinthians 3:6 talks about how Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Of those three characters, Paul, Apollos, and God, whose work was most important? Please say God.
Yeah.
We all agree on that?
Yes.
Why is that so important? Because what I spend my days doing is teaching, planting, and watering. What Dwight and Terry spend their days doing, Dan spends his days doing is teaching, planting, and watering. And if we are not careful, we think of planting as watering as guaranteeing an outcome. Planting and watering does not guarantee an outcome. Planting and watering creates an environment. And when we create that environment, we then count on God. Let me give you an example. My grandfather was what the Bible calls a steward. He farmed 140 acres that was owned by an absentee landlord. He was a citrus farmer in Southern California. He managed the environment and nurtured his orchard just exactly like Paul and Apollos, who spent their days planting and watering. And what did my grandfather spend his days doing? He spent his days working on amount of water, what the soil was like, the weeds. It turns out, though, that one of the things that my grandfather had to spend a lot of his time doing was trying to account for managing the temperature. Now, you would think you can't really manage the temperature, and that's weather. Well, in the Southern California area, especially in the valley where he was, the record low was only 29. So just below freezing. And when the temperature would start to get below freezing, what they would do is they would set up what they called smudge pots. Smudge pots were long, narrow pipes about this tall that they would fill with motor oil, and then they would burn them all night long. And I say this, and immediately the smell of smudge comes to my mind, because I know it had a very distinctive smell. And what he had to do is he had to put one of these between every one of his trees. And then he would spend the night, whenever it was supposed to be, approaching freezing or below freezing, he would spend his night all night long managing his smudge pots, making sure that you can imagine burning motor oil. It's this inky kind of mess. He would come back all just covered in this oily soot, but his trees would be alive. He couldn't guarantee that they would produce fruit, but he knew when they were in danger, and he could manage the environment. Now, when my grandparents finally moved off the ranch and they retired, they still kept trees. I mean, the only house they ever owned was this tiny little house that was next to a small orchard of about a dozen really, really large trees. And that was what I knew my whole life, was when I went and visited them, and they would still care for their trees. And when my grandmother was 103 years old, she still lived in that house, and she would still, with her walker, walk out to irrigate her trees and toddle out there and do her watering, because that was who she was. It was both an obligation, a burden, and a privilege. And that's what ministry looks like for us. It is both an obligation, a burden, and a privilege. And just like Paul planted and Apollos watered, Grandpa smudged and Grandma watered, but God gave the increase. Have I convinced you that that is a model for ministry? Because it's crucial for how we think about innovation. Because over and over, if we think about innovation as something that we can create, we can make happen, it will fail. I had a student once who was the president of a ball bearing company. And he was used to, you put raw materials in the machine at this end, it goes through the machine, and then at this end comes out ball bearings milled to the proper spec every single time. Guaranteed outcome. And if the ball bearings were wrong, you stop the machine, you fix the machine until you got a guaranteed outcome. We don't use a technology like a machine. We use technologies like a sermon. A sermon is designed to create spiritual growth. Does a sermon have a guaranteed outcome? Every one of us know moments when a really bad sermon actually blessed people. And we all know moments when someone preached what we thought was a really good sermon and nobody seemed to be any different. Now, good sermons generally do better than bad sermons in helping people, but it's not a guaranteed outcome. All we can do is, like Paul and Apollos, all we can do is plant and water, and then wait for God to give the increase. And that's going to change the way that we think about leadership. That's going to change the way that we think about innovation. I'm going to pause there and ask if there are any questions at first, and then if not, I'm going to give you a question. And yes. What's your name?
Mark.
Hey, Mark.
It just seems to me that churches and Christian communities.
Ooh, we got a mic. Look at this. Oprah's coming.
Churches and Christian communities have always lagged behind culture.
Yes.
All right. And if you're right, and you probably are, that culture is changing more rapidly now than ever, doesn't that mean then that we will always be reactive? And so the question would be, is like the aging boomer who's trying to keep up to be more and more on top of things, is it a winning strategy at all just to try to keep being less and less behind the culture?
So what you're asking is a crucial question. There's a reason that the churches have always been a little bit behind culture, because we are inextricably and happily tied to the past. We're about to have a conversation about what that means. We can never abandon the past. Our credibility is about being able to be linked to the past. So we're going to be inherently conservative in that we're never going to just cut our ties to the past and just go out into the future. But at the same time, we have a tendency to be great at ministering to the last generation. And we're not particularly great at staying connected to this generation. And the next section, I'm going to spend some time talking about why that is. Because I think there are some things about how we do ministry that can change so that we are not, we have not abandoned young people, but we have not abandoned the culture, but at the same time, we have not gotten so caught up that we let the culture drive the train. And I'll summarize it this way. Ultimately, what we have to do is stay in touch with the questions that the culture is asking, and then allow the faith to be the one that creates new and productive answers to those questions. So the problem isn't so much that we're giving old answers. The problem is that we're answering old questions. And if we can stay connected to new questions, that will generate a way of answering those, of creating new answers that are still embedded in Christian tradition, Christian practices, but are driven by the life that young people, the life that young people, anybody under 45 is leading today. And that's, we're going to talk about that in the next section. But I think it's an important question. Yeah.
What do you do with the fact that the church is so intergenerational?
That's a great question. That is perfect.
Everybody's asking different questions.
That's perfect. And we're going to spend, well, I'll just say I'll do the brief version now, and then we'll talk about it more in a minute. Part of what we struggle with as the church is that God has entrusted to our care a whole set of people. It's not just, one group here, one group here. And what we have done in the past is we have decided that we are going to segment our ministries. And so that, we've got children's ministry, and then we've got youth ministry, and then we've got young adults, and then our expectation is you will not be a young adult for very long because we don't do much with you. But fortunately, we know that you're going to get married very quickly, because for generations, everyone got married very quickly. And then we'll get you back when they have kids. And then there's the young families, and then there's the middle age, and then there's we're really good at that. The problem is that there are pieces of that we do really well, and there are costs that comes with that we are so used to paying that we don't see anymore. So for example, the Florida Youth Institute did some research on what is the number one predictor, or what are the predictors that if a young person has this characteristics, that their faith will stick when they leave high school and go off to college. And this is called the Sticky Faith Project. And the number one predictor was, is there a relationship that person has with someone in their congregation of a different generation? Not their youth minister, but somebody but somebody of a different generation. And so what we're doing with the Florida Youth Institute is we're doing a lot of work on how to build intergenerational ministry. So intergenerational ministry may actually be one of the best ways to respond to young people. But it requires us to stop doing this segmented ministry and to discover that a lot of the questions that baby boomers or aging baby boomers and 17-year-olds are asking are actually pretty connected. One of the things that we work on with the Florida Youth Institute is the ideas of identity, belonging, and purpose. That at the core, we're going to talk about the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. But we're going to say that at the core of that, we're going to constantly be dealing with questions of identity, belonging, and purpose, because it's part of the human condition. And so I would argue that older adults and younger people have far more in common than they know, and it's our job to build those bridges.
Scott, we have one online, sorry.
We have one online, and then you're next.
The question is, if we're to plant and water, this gets into the point of discernment, and farmers have been planting in zones so they know what will and will not grow. How do we think about zones?
That's a great question. And I think it's partially related to the cultural question, is that a significant, and it's also related to global warming. You know, one of the questions that, that we're dealing with in Southern California is the fact that drought is the new normal. You know, every once in a while there's a year when we don't have drought and we think, oh yes, things have gone back. And what's happened is we're calibrated for a world that does not have drought. And so every time we have a little bit of an instance where it doesn't have drought, we all think, wow, the world has gone back to the way it once was. Well, everybody who's paying attention says that's not going to happen. And so part of what we have to do is there's a lot of characteristics. So if you know, my wife, when she wants to plant, she knows that we are in zone 8, I think, or something like that. And we have lots of conversations about zones, and I pay attention to some of them. The problem is that those were written about 20 years ago, and it's no longer true that the things that we have always known are still connected. So we have to pay attention to the zones, but at the same time, there's actually characteristics that we're going to have to look at, because how are the zones created? It's about how much water, how much sunlight, high temperature. It's going to be something with shading and not shading. I don't know quite how all this works, but the point is there's these characteristics. We're going to have to you know, the old model was to just look up what zone you're in. The new model is going to be, you have to learn how to pay attention so that you can calibrate what this year, what looks like our zone's going to be.
Thank you.
Yeah,
This thing, do
there you go.
I have it? Nope, not quite. Waiting for a green light.
There we go.
Skills. So similar question, and bringing up culture again. My church is a multicultural church, and I'm finding both generationally and culturally that people are asking different questions. And I think you haven't quite gotten to that yet. If we're looking for what question are they asking that's different than what they used to be asking, but also like some people are coming for a cup of water and some people are coming for their marching orders, and they're coming to the same church.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. We've had enough questions on that point. I'm just going to go forward, because
Move forward.
the next section is designed to answer those set of questions. I think I'm going to need to.
Feel affirmed.
Well, I'm going to do I'm going to take one set of comments about what is the meaning of innovation. I'm going to do that fairly quickly, so that we can get to when we're going to get to what standards do we calibrate for, the people and practices. That's going to get to your answer. But before I do that, I need to kind of talk about what the meaning of innovation is. I've talked to you about how we're never going to stop saying Jesus is Lord. Talked to you about how the question is, how do we maintain a rock solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel while at the same time creating innovative ways to express that faith in ever-changing culture. So let's go back to millennial church, this hypothetical church we've got that wants to recalibrate, and that they want to recalibrate in such a way that they're going to have to rethink the idea of attendance. Now, one of the first steps we might do in recalibrating is ask ourselves, is there anybody else out there who's dealing with this question? You know, let's not have to reinvent every wheel. Well, let me give you 2 examples of organizations in society right now that are dealing with these kinds of things. It turns out the NFL, you may have heard of them. They're having a big game here sometime in February, I hear. The NFL has had to recalibrate in the last 10 years because of the smartphone generation. It turns out that with a high-definition television and other things, it's now better for most people to stay home and watch a game than it is to go to the stadium. So they've had to reconfigure what attendance means. Just like the church needs to rethink attendance, and so who's willing to make kind of an investment in that? Well, the Atlanta Falcons just rebuilt $1.2 million, $2 billion, a new stadium just around being able to make sure that people with smartphones can come and enjoy the game. They have this thing they call the Halo, which is this giant big screen at the top of the stadium. So most people, when they're in the stadium, are no longer looking down at the game. They're watching it on this giant TV, but they're enjoying the being with all the people. They've had the tailgating, they, all that. I don't know if the new stadium that you just built here has that kind of thing, but if it doesn't, it soon will, because that's what the future looks like. They're going to have to rethink the meaning of attendance. At the same time, advertisers are rethinking what does it mean to be dealing with the smartphone generation. I was reading an article the other day where they were talking about how advertisers are adjusting to smartphones. Let me read you a little bit of it. Millennials and Generation Z had advertisers perplexed. Young people devour more content in more ways than ever before. They didn't like the old rules, so they changed them. They don't want to pay for 700 cable channels, and they certainly don't want to watch boring commercials for 3 straight minutes. The author notes that his daughter leans on Apple TV, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, and YouTube, all of which she can view on her smartphone. And then she hops on Instagram, zips through pictures and devours cooking videos. She texts her friends and hangs out with them on House Party. I didn't even know about House Party. This is apparently something where you can have multiple people FaceTiming each other at once. Again, no longer divided by location. And this is how she unwinds. Advertisers know that they are not going to lure her and her smartphone generation back to broadcast TV. So they've had to adjust. And that leads the author to his final conclusion. Any company that decides, I don't like where things are going, they were better for me the old way, we got to keep the old way, is doomed to fail. We in the church are tempted to say, things were better for me the old way. Ronald Heifetz, who those of us who teach leadership talk a lot about, one of the things he says is people don't resist change, they resist loss. But the converse is also true. People don't embrace change, they embrace gain. And we have lots of examples of people with power resisting change or failing to embrace it because they themselves are not the ones that benefit from the change. Let me give you a quick example. In the 19th century, there was this new innovation called ether. Ether was the first thing that they had that they would allow somebody to be unconscious when they were having surgery on them. And we can all agree that that is a better thing than having surgery while awake. Okay. One would think that was non-controversial. There was one group that opposed ether in one particular setting. And you know who that was? Christian clergymen. And they were opposed to ether for expectant or for mothers that were giving birth. Because in Genesis, it said that the curse on Eve was to be having pain in childbirth. Yes, that is the appropriate response. Now, here's how hypocritical it was. At the exact same time, there were all these innovations that were making labor easier. So what was the curse that what happened at that point? There was a curse towards Adam and one to Eve. Eve was about being in labor, and for men, it was about the sweat of your brow. So apparently those same clergymen were open to one kind of change and not open to another. And what was the boundary line? What did it affect them? It was better for me the old way, or it wasn't good for me the new way. And so it was easy for them to embrace one change and to oppose another because it was about what worked for them. It's about power. And I want to emphasize this point because what's going to happen is we start talking about intergenerational, we start talking about cultural kinds of issues, especially multicultural situations. What's going to end up happening is that it's going to be very easy for those with power to be in favor of some changes and to oppose others based on what's good for them. And they won't know that they're doing it. At this point, we're going to talk in a moment about a different kind of understanding for innovation. But I want to start by talking to you about, do you understand this idea of mental models? You know what a mental model is? you have a mental model of a car. What's a mental model of a car? Whatever, if I were to ask you, it would probably involve something that has 4 wheels, a windshield, something like that. And if I were to show you a picture of something that was this giant round thing that had 18 wheels on one side and a big sled on the other, you would go, I don't know what that is, but it's not a car, because it doesn't fit your mental model. Okay, fine. What's your mental model of a preacher? I have to ask my students that because it's often whoever they grew up with. Is it somebody in a robe standing in a pulpit? Less so nowadays. Is it a man standing on a dais with a big black Bible in one hand, talking about a scripture one verse at a time? Well, for some of them, yeah. Is it somebody in a Hawaiian shirt? That's a common thing nowadays. Your mental model shapes for you your expectations. And your expectations tell you what things should be and it calibrates your expectations. And those are what you aim for. And why is all that important? Because we're going to talk about a mental model for innovation. And I want to suggest to you that I want to offer a different model than you're used to. I would suggest that there are typically 5 ways that people think about innovation. And at this point, I'm on page 3 of your handout if you're wondering where I've wandered off to. There are product innovation, things like a light bulb or an iPhone. There's process innovation. Process innovation is the creation of the assembly line, or Toyota when they created the Toyota Way that completely transformed how we think about quality. There's internet innovation, things like apps or websites or the like. There's social innovation. And you need to understand, social innovation is often about doing innovative things that are good for society. But there are 2 competing definitions for social innovation that are out there. One by a guy named Dees at Duke, and then Roger Martin and Sharon Osberg. Osberg, is that her name? I think so. Yes. And they're at the Skoll Foundation, and they have a very different definition. Why is that important? Because most Christians who talk about innovation really mean social innovation. They don't mean changing Christianity. They don't mean what they mean is social innovation, and it means one of 2 things to them. Either we're going to do innovative things that do good in society, like we're going to create a different way to deal with homelessness, or it means we're going to find a for-profit way to do something that we would like to be able to do anyway. So a church that starts a lawn mowing business or something like that. If you were to talk about innovation in the church, that's the typical way that most people would talk about it. I would argue that any of those 4 definitions aren't going to get us where we need to go. I want to point to a 5th definition, and that would be meaning-making innovation. The innovation of meaning, I would argue that our job is to make meaning. That's what we're in it for. Let me give you some examples of meaning-making innovation. You might have heard of this guy named Martin Luther. I use this example. I would use this at Wesley Seminary. But what did Luther do? What he offered. There was a lot of ways in which he was innovative. But the most important thing, that everything else comes from a new reading of the book of Romans. That new reading of the book of Romans transformed everything. And he didn't offer a new Bible, so he was still tied to the past, but he offered a new reading of it that changed everything. So for the rest of the time that I'm talking to you, when I say innovation, I'm going to mean meaning-making innovation. So I need to pause and give you 2 examples of what meaning-making innovation would look like. The first one is I want to point to a company called IDEO. IDEO has been doing interesting design stuff for a couple of generations. The human-centered design stuff that we'll talk about later that you guys work on comes from IDEO. When Steve Jobs decided that he wanted to build this computer that included something called a mouse, he went to IDEO and said, I need you to build me the first commercial mouse. So that's how long they've been involved in doing this innovative stuff. So at one point, a few years ago, a medical device, if you were in medical devices, a medical device company came to them. They make MRI machines. And they said, one of the problems we have with MRI machines is that it's very tough on children. If anybody's ever had an MRI, you know you're in a very constrained place, very loud, and approximately 80% or something like that of children that needed to have an MRI had to be fully sedated. And you can imagine how hard that is on the body. And so what they did is they came to IDEO and they said, we want you to create a new MRI machine so that we no longer have to sedate children. And so what they were looking for was product innovation. They want a new device. So what did IDEO do? They spent a bunch of time looking at how young people experience these machines. And they said, yeah, they get scared by their small places and the loud noises. But they also spent a lot of time looking at the kids, and they discovered that under other settings, those kids would be willing to tolerate, like going to Disneyland. Loud noises in small places. It's all about the story that you use to make meaning. And what they did is meaning-making innovation. And so what they did is they created an MRI machine that was tricked out to look like a pirate ship. And then they dressed all of the nurses and people that were working there and as if they had parts. And when they brought the kids in, they told them that you're going to go on an adventure, but you're going to be captured on a pirate ship and you'll be rescued. You have lines that you're going to have to say. Other people have lines that you're going to have to, at one point, you're going to have to act this out by being trapped in the hold, and you're going to have to, there's going to be all these noises around you, and you're going to have to be very brave. And they tricked another machine out to look like a princess castle. And there was this whole thing about being a princess in a castle and all this kind of stuff. And they let them choose which one they wanted to be in. And guess what happened? They didn't have to make new MRI machines. All they had to do was dress them up and offer them a new story, a new way of making meaning. And that flipped the statistic. It used to be something like 80% of kids had to be sedated, and now 80% of kids don't need to be sedated. And I've got a picture here. I'm going to skip down because I've been mostly skipping through. So that's what it looks like. That's an MRI machine tricked out to look like a pirate ship. What did they offer? They were asked to create a multi-million-dollar device, and instead they created a new story. What's the second example? I want to point you to Martin Luther King. In 1955, if you were African American living in the South, you had only two responses that you could have to Jim Crow. You could either rise up in violence, or you could lay down in pain. And those were your only options. And the Montgomery bus boycott starts in December of 2019. Try that again. December 1955. And the first Monday of the boycott, it's been very successful. They decide they're going to have a mass meeting at Baptist Church. It becomes so popular they have to replicate it 5 times in 5 different churches that night. And about a half an hour before the meeting, they turn to this young preacher and they say, you're going to have to speak to everybody. So Martin Luther King's got about 15 minutes to write his speech. And I have my students read this speech, and we spend a lot of time talking about it. Because here's what he talks about. He says that you've been told that you have to either be good Christians or good Americans. Good Americans obey the law, and good Christians stand up for justice. And right now, there is no way for you to stand up for justice without expecting that it will devolve into violence. So what do? And then he goes on to explain to them this concept of nonviolence. Because they had thought at this point that the boycott that they had for that one day was probably a strategy that would be the precursor to eventually having violence. So they thought that what happened is this is where you start, but eventually we're going to have to either take this to its logical conclusion and rise up in protest, and that will be violence, or we will have to eventually back down and lay down, and we will lose. And what he said is, no, there's an alternative. And he offered to them this idea of protracted nonviolence. And he talks about what Gandhi did, but the most important thing he says is, this allows you to be both good Christians and good Americans. He changed the way that they saw themselves and they saw society. He offered them a new way of making meaning. That's the kind of innovation that we're talking about here. That's the kind of innovation that will transform society. So when I talk about innovation, I'm meaning meaning-making innovation. Luther, Martin Luther reconfiguring how we think about Romans. IDEO creating a new kind of MRI machine, or Martin Luther King introducing the idea of nonviolence. That's what we're going to talk about. And Millennial Church will have to do more than simply convince young adults to once again attend services. They're going to need to find a way to make spiritual sense of the lives the millennials entrusted to their care. So I'm going to get to the culture question in a moment, but are there any other issues, any other questions you want to bring up? Oh, good, somebody in the back.
Yeah, so.
Oh, the microphone is coming.
Okay.
My question, sorry, is that really loud? My question relates both to inclusion of young people, but it's also an issue of power dynamics, and that I find most church settings never include youth or young adults in the new story making narrative, which is also a power dynamic of the clergy and the, you know, adult lay people really saying, okay, this is how we're gonna create this new story. And I think that also harkens back to this old generation of church where the adults don't think that youth and young people can make wise choices. And that's absolutely false. So I think it's also a case where how do we include young people in this whole process?
So I'm going to give you two answers. One is I'm going to refer you to a book called Growing Young. This is the Fuller Youth Institute did a massive study of churches that are doing well in dealing with youth. And they came up with 6 core commitments that the churches, the ones that they found that were doing well, all shared these core commitments. And one of them was what they call keychain leadership. And the reason they call it keychain leadership is what it's about is handing over leadership to young people and allowing them to do things that we would typically not allow them to do much sooner than we allow them to do. So the example that they used is at a church where a young person had been volunteering and helping with some things. And at one point they turned to him and they said, we want you to be in charge of stocking the soda machine. Now, that means we're going to give you the key to the soda machine. But not only that, to be able to get in, you're going to need a key to the church. So we're going to give you a key to get into the church anytime you want to stock the machine. And that became then not just stocking the machine, doing all these other things. But he became a leader that was able to do all these wonderful things in the church. But if you go back to the moment he will tell you that everything changed, it's when they gave him a key. And they said, you can go and do it when you think it's right. We don't need to supervise you. I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to let you stock the soda machine, but we're going to have an older person looking over your shoulder the entire time that you do it because you might steal from us or something like that. That's not trust. That's the opposite of trust. That's we're going to get you to do labor that we could have done anyway.
I want to push back a little bit. So I think that's a great example of giving youth power.
But I'm talking about, like, I have 2 teenagers that they're just craving what I think is spirituality and religion and. Should I start over, or
You
did
have
you?
you have
Okay.
2 teenagers who are craving spirituality.
Yes, and they do not want to be in church, but yet what they're looking for, they probably could get in a church setting if it was done in a way where they had input. So I think that's a great example, but I want my kids to learn the gospel message, but the way they're being taught does not work for them or their generation. So why can't we, and maybe there are examples of churches that do this, why can't we involve them in that important work of actually telling us what would work for them and allowing them to do it? So I don't want to get rid of the gospel. I think,
Good.
and I actually think, and I see my kids doing this, they are attracted to literature and film that are secular, but they have biblical messages and themes. And I think they're attracted to it because these themes are so crucial and important and embedded in our culture. But yet, I also want them to be getting that in church. And they need to be telling us that, but we're not listening to them. And so how do we bring them in and really listen and allow them to have some of that power that we adults have traditionally co-opted and not allowed them to have?
So I said that I was going to give you 2 examples. One of them was Fuller Youth Institute. Second one is that we're working on a project we're calling Young Adult Ministry Innovations, where we're using a lot of this innovative process to work with young adults. And so we have a cohort of 24 churches that are coming in to work with us on this. But one of the requirements is that you had to send 2 church leaders, one of which had to be in senior leadership, and you had to send 2 young adults. Because the last thing we wanted to do was to create something for young adults. What we wanted to do, as we say over and over again, is we want to create something with young adults. And so it becomes far more complicated, but that's okay. So that's one story. I'm going to actually tell another one in a moment. Well, let me just go to that. Let me set something up, and then I want to tell the story. What I would like to suggest is that the standards for recalibration are the church must sync to an ever-changing world and align with the unchanging Christian gospel. And I'm going to suggest that we're going to recalibrate according to people and to our practices. And here's where I would say the goal is. The goal is to create shared stories of future hope that make spiritual sense of the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. That's where we're headed. Shared stories of future hope is my definition of vision. When I teach vision in my classes, I talk about the definition of vision is a shared story of future hope. I believe that the entire reason that people come to church is because they want their lives to make spiritual sense. And that this idea of sense making, of making meaning, is what we are most involved at. And it's not just in making spiritual sense, but making spiritual sense of the things that matter. What was your name? Julie. When Julie talks about her kids that are interested in watching movies or paying attention to things that are going to help them make meaning, if they're not finding it in the church, they will go someplace else. And so what I'm going to suggest is that the first step for us in dealing with the people that, so we're going to calibrate to people and we're going to calibrate to practices, is I'm going to give you 4 questions that you can ask. Who are the people entrusted to your care? What are their longings and losses that they experience, so they experience the human condition? How do they make sense, how do you make spiritual sense of those longings and losses? And how do you turn that into a shared story of future hope? That should be written on your page, on your handout, but yeah. So let's start with who are the people entrusted to your care? And this gets to, I'm sorry, what was your question? What was your name, sir? What was your?
James.
James. James was originally asking about culture. Who are the people entrusted to your care? You need to pay attention to the people of them on their terms. And so you ask about how do we pay attention to intergenerational questions or to, okay, if you look around the people entrusted to your care, some of them are going to be younger and some of them are going to be older. That's part of it. Some of them are going to come from one culture, some of them are going to come from a different culture. Some of them are, you're going to have to recognize who are the people that God has placed in front of you. And sometimes that's those who are in your congregation. And sometimes those who are entrusted to your care who are not yet in your congregation. Church where I worship, we are a nice Presbyterian church in a nice suburban area in a nice part of a nice Southern California. And everything on Sundays is very nice. And part of the reasons that happens is because there's nobody who comes to our church who is experiencing a great deal of pain, or if they are, they're not allowed to talk about it. We have rules about that kind of thing. So that when I turn to you and say, how are you doing? What is the appropriate answer? What if that's a lie? That's still the appropriate answer. And so part of what we have to do is, remember I started by saying that leadership begins with listening. We need to be able to listen to people long enough that they can tell us the truth. Because part of what's happened is that we in the church have stopped listening. And we have stopped listening in such a way that we penalize people who tell us what we don't want to hear, especially if they talk to us about their pain. So why do I use this term longings and losses? It's a shorthand for thinking about the human condition. You were talking about watching movies and the like. If I wanted to talk to you about the human condition, and it was 50, 75 years ago, what would I do? I'd probably pull out Shakespeare. And we'd look at what's the most famous speech in all of Shakespeare? To be or not to be. Where Hamlet is standing there trying to decide whether to kill himself. And why is he trying to decide whether or not to kill himself? Because life is hard. And he lists what he calls the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. So 50, 75 years ago, we would have had a great conversation about Shakespeare. Would that pay attention to the people that are mostly entrusted to our care? That's not going to resonate. So let me try instead. How many of the people entrusted to your care know anything about Pixar? You ever seen Pixar movies? I would argue that at the core of every Pixar movie is a question of the human condition. So the very first Pixar movie is Toy Story. And Toy Story, it's about a toy who's named Woody, who is a cowboy toy, who kind of rules this group of people, and they all have a kid entrusted to their care. The toys they serve a young boy named Andy. And that is what they exist, that is why they exist. Another toy, Buzz Lightyear, comes in, and he disrupts everything, and it causes a question of identity, belonging, and purpose. All for Woody as he's trying to figure this out. And ultimately, there's a moment at the very end of the movie when he's trying to figure out what his responsibilities are, who he is, and he looks at the bottom of his foot, and he sees Andy's name is written on it. In other words, what he's done is he, at the moment of greatest difficulty, finds his identity in the one whose name is written on his soul. I think that would preach. But we could go through every single Pixar movie because they work really hard to make sure that the human condition is at the core of whatever they do. Whether they're writing about toys or bugs or cars or whatever it is, they work really hard to ask the questions that are most at the human condition. So how do you know what the kind of questions are at the most of the human? Oh, Terry?
I have a piece that I think you can weave into here. A question online says, to what extent is innovation required just for youth or young adults? Do we need it for older generation? But I
Do we
think
need it
in
for-
this, can you weave that
Absolutely.
answer into this?
Because do we need it for the old? First, the question, do you think that there is anyone over 65 who struggles with questions of identity, belonging, or purpose?
Yes.
What?
The Pixar movie Up.
Yes. The Pixar movie Up. As a matter of fact, when I teach belongings and losses in my class, I show them the first 6 minutes of Up. And we list all the longings and all the losses that are involved there. And we spend all of our time talking about what's going on there. Do you believe that any question of identity, belonging, and purpose has changed for the older generation in the last 10 years?
Yes.
I mean, the very questions of what it means to be an older person in our society are changing. So of course we're going to have to innovate, because otherwise we're going to be offering them good, what I call cutting edge 1972 answers. And it's just, it's great. Was that did somebody have a question?
Well, I'm writing a book on elders rising. Those 3 questions, out of all the interviews I've done, are the 3 questions that rise at the core. And can Dick Wall's age wave work says the way they are being asked has changed for the elderly.
So you say you're writing a book, we're interviewing the elderly, and you're finding that identity, belonging, and purpose are at the core of those questions.
Yeah.
And those questions are changing. The questions of identity in 2017 are completely different than they would have been in 2005. I don't need to go further. Yes.
Thank you.
So absolutely, positively.
And thank you from online.
So let me tell you how to think about longings and losses. I want you to think about them as the things that keep people awake at night. So you know that moment when you go to bed and you put your head on the pillow and you haven't fallen asleep yet, and all the issues of the day come rushing in, whether they are things that you hope for, things that you worry about. You know that moment? Yeah, apparently too well. Your responsibility as a leader is to know those things for the people entrusted to your care. Most people that I know, if I sit down with them that are people that are leading congregations, and I say, what are those things for their people? They go, I don't know. And they start based on, well, what I read in a magazine article would be people that age might say, no. A significant part of what it means to lead God's people is to sit and listen to them. And listen to them long enough that you can actually know what those things are. I teach what's called the Touchstone class at Fuller. It's the very first class that students take. And one of the things that we practice is listening. And not just listening about, tell me your deepest, darkest secrets. That's not going to work. So what do? I have them, the assignment that we did this week is they had to go and visit somebody in their workplace and then interview them about their work. All these questions that they had to answer about, just tell me about the experience. How do you commute to work? What do you do at lunchtime? How many times, who do you talk to during the day? All those, and all it was designed to do was to elicit stories. And then I asked my students to write a case study based on what they heard about what life is like for that person. Well, at first they're going, I don't know. And they come back and they kind of like, quietly, they look, I found this really helpful. I never listened to people like that before. And I wanted to say to them, that's kind of why the assignment exists. But listening to the longings and losses of the people entrusted to your care, that's your preaching and teaching agenda. You want to know what to preach and teach about? Pay attention to the longings and losses of the people entrusted to your care and help them make spiritual sense of it. That is the entire thing that you're designed to do. The problem is that in the world, as the world changes, you would love to be able to say, oh, look, I can pull off the shelf answer 7B to this question that everyone else has already figured out. But it turns out that we don't have all those answers. And that's why it's going to take agility. A significant part of agility is the ability to create in the moment. So making spiritual sense of the longings and losses of the people entrusted to your care. I'm going to pause there and see if there are more questions. Young man.
Usually people address me as highly attractive young man.
The elderly gentleman in the back?
Yeah, exactly. So, I two different things. One is, I wonder if the metaphor of recalibration isn't radical enough. As whatever metaphor as we've seen here today, when you've gone to other metaphors, they take over the conversation. Like the farming thing did. It seems to me that recalibration is about fine tuning, it seems to me that you are, maybe it works with the listening part, which I agree is the ministry practice that most of us need to learn. So that's just, I'd like to hear you think about that. The other thing is that none of the metaphors for change that you've gotten at really get at the huge issue of pluralism. When I think about, we're in this age of pluralism, and how do if there's a never-changing gospel, but people are doubting it because of their experiencing pluralism everywhere they are. So those are my two fastballs for you.
I'm going to answer them by talking about the Old Testament, which is kind of dangerous when an Old Testament scholar asks a question. And I'm going to give an example, and then I'm going to loop back to what your questions were. So a significant part of what I teach my students, and part of what we're working on in this book, is what is the appropriate biblical response to loss? Lament. So part of what we're working on is, how do you construct laments for the people entrusted to your care? And so this is where ministry with. Part of what we're doing is we're mobilizing, how do we create laments for young people, whether it's for youth or young adults? Somebody here probably has been to a youth group at some point. And the format for a youth group is kind of the same, where they have, gathering, and they play a game, they sing some songs, they maybe pray for some people, there's a lesson, that kind of thing. One of the things that we're trying to experiment with is, what if there was, during every gathering of youth, a time for lament? And that there was a structure, just like, there's only a limited number of songs apparently you're allowed to sing at a young, with youth, that if we were to go to youth in St. Paul, or if we were to go to St. Thomas, in Virgin Islands, we would find basically the same kinds of songs. What if we established a raft of laments that would be flexible enough that they could talk about people's lives, but they would be enough that they could get used to that. And what we're starting with, the experiment we're running right now, is we're starting with just having them start with talking about lament about tragedy. A fire, a flood, a earthquake, or whatever, how do we talk about that? And we do that enough, there's enough tragedies in our world that we can do that. And then eventually we can start to move to where we can make it, and we can incorporate in things that are more local to them, stuff that had happened in their area that you would know about only if you lived in that area. And then as they get closer, if we've done that for a couple of months, we're going to start doing with things where you can lament stuff. My grandma has died. I know of a friend who's had this trouble, that's a little still at arm's length. But they've had all this experience legitimating lament. And then in a small group context, we'll let them write their own laments. Because one of the nice things about Old Testament scholars is they've taught us about form criticism. And we can look at laments, and they've got a little structure. And we can do lament Mad Libs. And not quite Mad Libs, but the kind of thing where they can build into their lament the kind of structure, and then they can say what they need to say. But only once they've had it be legitimated for them by practicing it again and again and again. And so that's a way of offering something that the church would all recognize. It's in all of their Bibles. I had somebody ask me, how do I know what a Psalm of Lament is? And the short answer I gave them is, those are the Psalms they don't read at your church. It's not quite true, but it's close. And if we can get them to pay attention to that's the appropriate response to loss. So many of our churches say the only appropriate response to loss is to say, look at the bright side. Pretend that we are so afraid of crucifixion that we are going to jump straight to resurrection. We are so afraid of suffering that we are going to jump straight to the eschaton. And that turns out to be really bad theology. And it is the theology that we have in our seminaries accidentally allows our students to adopt, because they don't have structures for talking about suffering without freaking people out. Well, the Old Testament has this lament specifically for that purpose. And so what I would do is, when I say recalibrate, I don't just mean tweak a little bit. We're going to have to introduce things that we have ignored for generations. And we're going to have to, if we pay attention to this whole Bible thing, it's going to change us. Because if we take those longings and losses and go back to Scripture, we're going to find that we are far more out of calibration than we thought. But the other thing you asked about was pluralism. I'm not interested in taking pluralism on head on, because what I'm interested in is the fact that I think the gospel stands up to pluralism, but the gospel that we've been presenting to our churches doesn't. And that if we present a gospel that takes suffering seriously and gives them a voice for talking about suffering, that gives them a voice for talking about their longings, that allows them to express that, that allows them to write their own. We talked about this at Fuller Youth Institute. We had a group in for innovation. And one of the churches went back and in their youth group built a wailing wall. And what they did is they built out of foam this wailing wall, and they gave students little bits of paper that they could write whatever they wanted, and they stuck it in there, and they just told them that after our gathering, what will happen is that there will be people that from this church that will take those out, and they will pray for them, and no matter what you write. And they had some students that wrote some really difficult things. They have one student there who's struggling with some mental issues and just wrote curse words. And they knew who it was, and they just kept praying for him. And the fact that they didn't scold him, the fact that they didn't overreact to that, actually had a pretty big effect on him. Over time, he began writing about the abuse that he was experiencing, and they were able to do something about that. But it became so effective at the congregation, or at the youth group, that the adults said, can we have one? And so they built something like it in their main sanctuary. And they allowed people then to just put in whatever, It's interesting. When you ask for prayer in your church, anybody here have a church that has a prayer chain where, you pass things around, you pray for things? Okay, if I were to look at the prayer chain of your church, with what would be those things be on there? Health stuff? Somebody's lost a job? Traveling mercies? We get that one in my church. I'm not sure what that is, but okay. Anything else? A little bit of the relationship, but the wealth, the breadth of the human condition is not captured there. What they needed was a different space that says, we're not allowed to talk about what we're really thinking and what we're really feeling, the losses that are really happening in our lives. We're not allowed to talk about those on the prayer chain. So we need a different space where we can roll something up and stick it in there and know that somebody will still pray for us. Our churches are failing not because we need a new gospel, but because we are failing to live up to the gospel that we've already been presented. And that's, to me, most about anchoring in the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. Is that a handout? Yeah.
Thank you. A couple of connections that just popped out. I mean, one is in terms of identity, belonging, and purpose, there's a really powerful alignment in the pronunciation of the Father, Jesus, you are my son, whom I love, and whom I will please. With respect to lament in the New Testament, my personally most gripping passage is where Jesus comes down from the mountain of transfiguration to the crowd and the boy with the seizure spirit who cannot be cast out. And he stops everyone, he makes everyone wait, including the boy, in the midst of his affliction, so that he can listen to the Father. He says, how long has he been this way? And the Father laments. That's incredibly powerful there. And then I wanted to pick up on Rolf and recalibration, because I really agree that we're so stuck into this fix and freeze that recalibrate feels like, oh, I've recalibrated, now I'm good to go. And that's coming from a mental map of having a map where you get off the map and you recalibrate, now you're back on the map, you follow the map. I think the mental map needs to be that there is no map, and that navigation, there is no terrain. Navigation now is like flying through the asteroid field. So that recalibrating is a constant fast cycle of where am I now, what's coming at me, where am I trying to get in general? And you recalibrate, you make a move. And by moving, everything has changed again. And so recalibration is a constant process of adjusting, of seeing where you are, reorienting, and acting.
Part of what I'm thinking about is I'm playing with, I love the idea that you don't like it because you want it to go further.
Yeah.
Part of what's interesting to me is that, what's the first thing I said to you? The church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. And I had to pause to see, you buy that? Because in a number of settings, I get a lot of pushback on that.
Really?
That is the appropriate response. That is the appropriate response. Yes, yes. Because I get an enormous pushback in this way. They say the job of the secular world is calibrated for the secular world, and that we're calibrated for Jesus's world, and they should be calibrating to us. We shouldn't be paying attention to them. And that any time that you talk about calibrating for a world that doesn't exist, what you've already done is you've sold the gospel down the road, and that you're allowing the secular world to drive the train. All that. Yeah, there's the problem right there. Yeah. At that point, I don't need to say more. But see, the fact that you bought that, I just tossed out a bunch of stuff that I would have normally done because I didn't need to. You're ready to go a lot further. That's kind of interesting. You have a question?
Yeah, so the answer to this might really be another presentation entirely, but what I keep thinking about as you speak is how this works, or what this looks like in a congregation where the senior leadership is still working from that kind of like 1972 model, and what sort of kind of conversion or recalibration work is necessary for us as millennial church leaders to invite senior leadership into before we can even have a conversation about how these practices could be actually implemented in our communities. Like, how do we can't wait for that entire generation of clergy to retire. so right, but I mean, it's a really serious question. I think about all the time is, not in a kind of like heuristic way, but just
This is your daily life.
Right, but my daily life is how far do I push and how long do I wait, or how loud do I have to be before someone will listen to. So much of what you're talking about is conversations that I had 5, 6, 8 years ago when I worked for a bishop, and there was just no willingness to even entertain that this was the direction the church was headed. So
let me give you 3 answers that are various layers to it. The first is a lot of the work I do at the Fuller Youth Institute, we end up asking this very question, because what will happen is that we have youth ministers come and they say, great, I want to do something different, And my church can't find out
Right.
because I have a jurisdiction, and as long as I stay within that jurisdiction, I can do it. And so the joke that I tell with my students is I said, every one of you that gets hired to a church job will have the same job description. It won't look the same, but the job description will be this: help us grow, don't change anything. And okay, what do you do in that kind of a moment? And so the book Growing Young has been great about working on what to do when you want to change, but how do you help people change who are still in the midst of that? And the next thing that we're working on, one of the authors of that book is Jake Mulder, and Jake's now doing his PhD with me, and we are specifically working on the question is, how do we do whole congregation change? And one piece of that is, what is the role of the senior pastor? And so what all the rest of the answers I'm going to give you are based on the work that we are doing together. Jim Collins, in his book, what was the red book? Good to Great, thank you. At one point when he's talking about the social sectors, he talks about how important it is to create what he calls pockets of greatness. What he means by that is you may not have the jurisdiction to do the whole thing in your world, but there is something you have jurisdiction over. So don't get so caught up in what you can't do that it prevents you from doing what you can do. And oftentimes what happens is success breeds opportunity. And so if you can do what you need to do in your own jurisdiction, that opens up stuff. The other thing is, now in every other context, I have a very hard time answering this question because it requires me to give a whole lecture that I'm not going to give. In this one context, I don't have to do that because I know I want to refer to adaptive change and I want to talk about Ronald Heifetz. And I know that in this context, part of what you learn in your leadership classes is about Heifetz and adaptive change. Because I would argue that Heifetz's key question, he never says it this way, but the way I translate his question is, how do you help people change who desperately need to change and desperately don't want to change? Because people don't resist change, they resist loss. How do you help people change who desperately need to change and are desperate because they know it's going to cost them something they don't want to give up?
And that comes back.
And well, but you're back to senior leadership at that point. A significant part of what you have to do is ask yourself, what's it going to cost them? And then how do I figure out how to create a holding environment for them that helps them to face the fact that Heifetz talks about the pinch of reality. It's not that you pinch somebody, it's that reality is already causing them pain, they just want to ignore it. And so what you have to do is help them come to see that the current situation is actually much more painful for them than they want to acknowledge. Now, the reward that sometimes you will get for that is they will blame you for it. Just like my sister-in-law, who's the cardiologist, they will often blame her for the fact that they need to lose weight or quit smoking. But you just have to know that's part of what you signed up for. And there's a longer answer to that question, but that's as much as I can give you for right now.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
I want to go to the next part of it, because if we're talking about longings and losses, we're talking about people entrusted to our care, at some point you're going to ask me, how do you make spiritual sense of those things? And this is where I want to introduce you to the idea of Christian practices. I think it's not just a theology that we have to offer people. We have to offer them practices. And we have to help them see, oftentimes when I'm working with senior leaders, I have to help them come to discover that they have an impoverished understanding of the Christian practices. And that what we have to offer is not, well, worship as they know it is a cheesy shadow of what worship could be. So for example, let's go back to the millennial church example of the goal of how do you reach the smartphone generation. And we're talking about worship. What is the proxy that they use for worship in that congregation? If you show up. And the expectation is if you show up, then you're probably participating and that's good enough. So let's use some examples and see if we can recalibrate our understanding of this notion of practice of worship. So have any of you ever been to see the Philharmonic? Have you ever been to a concert like that? Near as I can tell, there's no singing, right? How many people are into it? How many people that are the audience are participating? Now, some percentage of people are sitting there bored out of their skull, but those are probably not the people that come back. Most of the people there are very into it, although they themselves are not singing, they're not participating. How many of you have ever heard of this play called Hamilton? Think about, you know about this kind of thing? You're pointing to people that, you know?
You went to it on Wednesday. I paid him.
2 days ago,
Did you like it?
indeed.
There's this wonderful article that's been written by a sports writer named Joe Pasnowski, who writes for Sports Illustrated, but he wrote in his blog about taking his daughter to see Hamilton. I read it while sitting in a coffee place in San Francisco with tears just running. Sometimes when you cry a little bit, it's just tears well up. These were not those kinds of tears. This is dripping on my bagel kind of tears as I'm reading this. Because what he's talking about is a young person who's struggling for answers and doesn't feel belonging and feels connection to this thing and has memorized all the words and uses it to narrate her week. That's how she talks and how she walks around in the world. Now, if we could find people that could participate in worship as well as somebody that goes to the Philharmonic, and somebody who could narrate their week with the words that they are encountering on Sunday morning, would we think that's a good way for worship to happen? That's not mostly what's going on in our churches. But what that just did is, what do we say? That practices set for us standards. The standard that we're going to use for worship is not, did you show up? The standard we're going to use for worship is, did you participate in such a way like the Philharmonic? Did you use it to narrate your week? And if that's going on, then we're making spiritual sense for people. So that's the first one. The second one is I want to point to the idea of small groups. Because this church, one of the things that they did is they said, we're going to move discipleship to small groups, and that if you show up for a small group, that's the equivalent of being a good disciple. That provides discipleship and community. Well, let's look at that. You all know who Robert Withnow is? Robert Withnow is probably the scholar that most understands American religion. He's a sociologist of religion at Princeton. At one point, he wrote 13 books in 12 years. And it was embarrassing because they were all really good. Just made the rest of us look like idiots. One of the studies he did was of small groups. And he found that small groups in America accomplish almost exactly the opposite of what they intend to accomplish. The goal is to provide depth and to provide community. And it provides just the opposite. To explain to you how that works, let me offer you one moment. Have any of you ever been in a small group setting? Yeah. Okay, you're in a small group, and there's somebody, you're talking about the Bible, and somebody says something that makes no sense. They've said something that, when I read scripture, here's what I hear. That this passage means, and everyone in the room knows that has no bearing on anything that's in the scripture. How do people respond? Thank you for sharing. Let's move on to the next person, right? We're not going to say to them, I think maybe your understanding of scripture is a little off here. Okay, let's say again, you offer prayer. You say, okay, I'd like you to pray for me because my boss is overbearing and mean to me and is creating all sorts of problems for my life. And please pray for me because I have such a terrible boss. What are we going to do? We're going to pray for him because he's got a terrible boss. Well, it turns out he may or may not have a terrible boss. He may actually be a terrible employee. But we'll never know that. We accept whatever he says and then reinforce it. What is community? Community is mutual accountability. There's no accountability in the ways in which we practice small groups. So we've got small groups that do neither depth nor community, but those are the things that this church is looking for as they hope you will join a small group. And if you don't join one, then we know that you're not really devoted because they have a location-based understanding of discipleship and worship. I could do the same thing in talking about vocation. We don't have as enough time, but can you see how the point here is to not just accept that we know how worship should look, but to take it and reconfigure our understanding, recalibrate our understanding of worship so that it's designed to accomplish what it's designed to accomplish. Yes?
So,
Oh, I'll get it. Oh, why don't I get you?
So I guess, as the finance person, I sort of think about the paradigm of attendance in terms of, how do we deal with the fact that one of the reasons we want people to be there is that when they attend, then they can make contributions both monetarily and probably more importantly, time-wise.
Sure.
They've been because most churches, and maybe this is part of the paradigm that needs fixing, rely upon volunteer labor from their members. And where does that fit into all this, I guess?
Absolutely. So as a church, we want people to give, not because of what that accomplishes, but because giving is an expression of generosity, and generosity is the opposite of selfishness. We want to cultivate generosity and not just the practice and the practical, right?
Maybe. We want both. Let's be honest. I mean, I think we want, we want people to give because they want to give, and it's, it's in giving you receive and all that stuff. But there is a practical piece when you are an institutionally based organization, and how do you sort of, maybe you're supposed to lead with the former, but how do you keep the latter behind you and not drive your thinking and behavior?
Okay, well, at this point, then I would offer you, Tom Jevons wrote a book, Thomas Jevons and Rebecca Birch-Basinger wrote a book called Growing Givers' Hearts. And what they did is they did a massive study of Christian fundraisers and discovered who was good at Christian fundraising and why. And what they discovered is that the best Christian fundraisers don't think in instrumental terms. They think in terms of making givers grow in their hearts. And the idea of they focus on generosity, and that they found that the more you focus on the instrumental, the less you get the instrumental. And the more you focus on generosity, the more you'll get the instrumental. So that's part of what I meant when I said we're going to focus on generosity, because it gets you both things, and focusing on the instrumental gets you neither. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, what we're setting up is standards. I haven't told you how I want to propose to recalibrate ministry to the smartphone generation yet. I'm going to give you an example in a moment. But whatever it is, one of the things that I didn't have as a standard, and now going forward, I'm going to have to talk about, okay, how are we going to handle giving? That's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to address, because that's part of what we expect happens on a Sunday morning. So I'll loop that back in when we get it in a moment. But can you see that what we're doing is we're creating a set of parameters, of standards, of saying, okay, whatever it is that we propose for what we're going to do to reach to the smartphone generation, it has to address worship in a way that talks about true participation and not just standing there, that talks about narrating your week, that we're going to talk about discipleship that involves depth and involves community. So what we've done is we've set a standard that is much higher than the current standard of what is being practiced already. And that what we're going to do is we're going to say, go back to the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care and say, how do we create something that is new, that addresses those longings and losses and does it in such a way that we can create these larger standards. Does that work for you? I want to say, before I give that example, which I will do in a bit, at some point you're going to want to ask me, what is the process? Is there a process for doing this? And if we had more time, what I would do is I would take some time to talk about, first of all, human-centered design. This is the way that IDEO and other Google, there's a book called Sprint that, Google has put out that is about what they call a Google Sprint, which is built on, it's a process for engaging in human-centered design so that you can go from not working on a problem to having a working prototype in a short period of time. And I could go into great detail about how we do those kinds of things. You're smiling, you've seen this book?
Oh, we're together on an innovation project, so we're seeing a lot of great material.
Okay, so Terry's pleased. Good. Okay, so we could.
Listening, Scott.
Okay, so good. So we're looking at human-centered design, and I would spend a lot of time on that. And then I could also take a significant amount of time to talk to you about practical theology and about how over the last generation, there have been a number of authors that have worked on practical theology, and they've come to something of a consensus of what practical theology looks like. What I'm going to argue is that the human-centered design process and the practical theology process ended up looking very similar. And so let me give you an example of what that looks like. I'll just advance that. So this is what human-centered design looks like. Starts with empathy or description, and then it goes through what they call a divergent move towards what they call ideation. I hate that term, but it's basically generating as many ideas as you can. And you can see why that's divergent. It goes into all sorts of directions. And then there's a convergent move where you have to come to a decision of what is it you hope to accomplish. And then you operationalize that to create a prototype, and then you engage in some experiment, and then you start the process again. Does that sound like what you're used to? Oh, good. If we were looking at practical theology, there's a bunch of different ways to talk about practical theology, but the general framework of it is it starts with experience in context, and then it goes to some kind of reflection that includes scripture and theology, but also social science, to where eventually you come to where you construct one goal, and then you come to the strategy part where you talk about how you're going to implement that goal, and then you work it out in the same cycle. In other words, it's a very similar kind of a process. I would argue that then Christian innovation then follows something that combines those two, and the way that we would combine those two is starting with empathetic listening, and then there's what we're going to call divergent ideation. Lots of ideas, as many as you can. And this process is actually on your paper. It's just not in a circle form. Yeah, I've embolded it so it'll be easy to find. Divergent ideation, lots and lots of ideas. Then convergent deciding. And then at that point, you go to experimental prototyping, you try it, and then you go through that process again. That's the process that we've been working with congregations as we engage in an innovation process. And I could spend way too much time talking to you about what that looks like. We've created for the churches that come through our cohorts an 8-week online learning process where they spend 2 weeks working on the particular problem and 5 or 6 weeks learning about innovation. And they do that before they come. And then we spend 48 hours engaged in an innovation process that looks like a Google Sprint. And at the end of it, they have a prototype that they can go back to their congregations to try. I skipped through that pretty quickly. Is there anybody who wants to stop and ask a question? Then I'm going to keep going. Because eventually, you're going to ask me about what are the pathways that, the other thing I should say is that in order to engage in this process, we have to make a theological move that is deeply uncomfortable for our churches. We're going to need a theology of experimentation. Most of our churches are used to what we have is there is right and wrong. There is orthodoxy and there is heresy. And everything that we do, we then engage according to either of those terms. But think about, let's say that the United States was trying to put a man on the moon in the 1960s. What did they do? They had a number of milestones that they wanted to meet along the way. The first thing we have to do is create a rocket that will launch without exploding. Then we had to be able to get one that will launch and go far enough into space that it will actually create something that that would go in orbit. Then we have to be able to launch something that we can land. Then we've got to pay attention to all the things that we're going to do, whether or not a human can, or a being. They started, I think, with a dog or a monkey, whether they could survive. And then we're going to get a person. All of these steps. And every time that they set a rocket off, it was to accomplish a step. We don't do that in the church. What do? We announce a new program. Usually we announce it to everyone. We have a logo and theme music, and we invite everyone to come and watch us make our rookie mistakes. And I want to offer you an image of what that's like. Now you remember Heifetz talks about a holding environment is something that is uncomfortable enough you can't stand still, and safe enough that you can experiment with a new way of being. So it's got to be both uncomfortable and safe. Now let's say there was a moment when I was teaching my daughter to drive. So what do? We went, the first time she ever got behind the wheel of a car, we went to the church parking lot in the afternoon when there was no one around, and I set up about 6 dirt clods and said, okay, your job is to weave in and out of these. And we made a whole story about how that there's these, that these are planets and that there are these beings living on it. And actually at one point she drove over them and we laughed about how she just destroyed a planet. We made it very light. Now let's say that I want to support my daughter. And so what I do is I build a grandstand in the church parking lot. And I invite all of her friends, all of her relatives, and they bring banners and giant pictures of her head, and they wave them and shout, and we say, this is how we're going to support you because we think it's important for you to learn to drive. Would that have made it easier or harder for her to learn? Why would it have been so hard? Because it was no longer safe to make mistakes. It was no longer safe to take the steps you need to take in order to learn. There was a whole bunch of steps that she needed to make that involved, okay, today she learned how to back up. She didn't go very straight, but she at least learned to back up. Okay, that was a good thing. But if that was all she did and people were looking around, it would be embarrassing. But what do we do in the church? We do the equivalent of that. We announce all this stuff that's going to be a new program, and we get everybody looking at it, and then we invite them to come watch us make our rookie mistakes. What we need to do is find ways to do experiments on the margins. So most of the time, I was going to turn to somebody who I guess is left. I was saying most of the time I don't tell I invite people not to tell your senior pastor when you're running experiments. They're not ready for prime time yet.
She already knows that secret, so.
Yeah, there we go. You try a bunch of stuff. And here's how you think about it. If I wanted to grow a really tall tree, would I plant one tree and then nurture it really well? No. What I would do is I'd plant a bunch of saplings and then nurture those. And then the ones that got to be tall, I would pull out the other ones and I would nurture those. And I would expect that if I nurtured enough saplings, one of them would grow to be very large. That's how innovation happens. You try a bunch of stuff and you don't know which of the things are going to be the saplings that are going to die and which are the saplings that are going to grow. And you just keep trying stuff and you'll learn from it. Most people that I know, most churches that I know, they come and they spend a lot of time talking, until they come up with one idea and they decide that one idea is the idea and they try it. And when it doesn't work perfectly the first time, they say, well, we tried it. We need a theology of saplings. A theology that says we try a bunch of stuff and then we keep doing it until something is going to grow. If you wanted to grow a big tree, you wouldn't just plant one tree. You'd plant a bunch of saplings. That's what we need to be able to do. So I've got 5 minutes left. And I've got more than 5 minutes to say, so I'm going to say a couple of things quickly, and then I'll give you my, we're going to go back to the example of how do we recalibrate for that one church. And I want to introduce you to the idea of the adjacent possible. The adjacent possible is where you look at things from other worlds, other eras, and figure out what can we learn from them. And so I want to give you 2 examples from the adjacent possible that will help us inform how we think about the example of what we might prototype. The first is what we learned at Fuller in online education. one of the things that we started offering courses online. And immediately the goal was for the faculty was to determine, are the courses online as good as the courses in person? And we quickly figured out that was the wrong question. Because it turned out the courses online were much better at some things, but they were things that we had come to believe that no education could do and we undervalued. And we began to realize that there was a difference between what we call uprooted education and embedded education. Uprooted education is the model where you uproot yourself from whatever community you're in. You move to some place and that you come and you temporarily live there. And it's a model that says that you can have Christian formation and growth with a very small modicum of community. You're never going to be as embedded as you were in the local community before you left. The online model says instead you're going to be embedded in community and that everything you do is on behalf of the people entrusted to your care. And the way that I explained this to my faculty at one point is I said, think of the assignments that I can make if I know every one of my students is embedded in community. I can assign them each week to try some things at home. You know, don't try this at home. I actually tell them, try this at home, and then I want you to write reflectively about it every single week. And if we get them to do that enough weeks in a row, it becomes a habit of trying new things and reflecting on them. So the point is that there's a difference between uprooted community and embedded community. And the model of church that we've always had is you uproot yourself from, say, your workplace or your home or whatever, and you go to church, and that's where you participate in worship. What would community, what would small discipleship look like if you weren't uprooted? If you were sitting in your workplace and on your smartphone engaged in your Bible study and your prayer and that kind of thing? Does that allow us opportunities that would be different? So that's the first adjacent possible. The second one is, I want to talk about communities of practice. This is something from a guy named Etienne Wenger. And the best example I have is Xerox repairmen, what they call tech reps. John Seeley Brown, when he was at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, the place that created the first personal computer, was commissioned by Xerox to figure out how do people learn to be good repair people? Because they invest all this money into sending them off to classes, and they were trying to figure out if the classes make a difference. He says, standing in a classroom. And what they found was that they learned some knowledge, but when did they learn how to be a tech rep? They learned it because what would happen is they would participate in what he called a community of practice. There'd be a group of them that'd be sitting around drinking coffee, waiting for somebody to have a call. And then you'd have a call and you'd go out, and you'd have a call and you'd go out, and that'd be fine. Well, at some point, you'd come across something that was difficult, you didn't know what to do. And you send out the bat signal. And what would happen then is they would come to your place or talk to you on the phone, and that you would all work it out together, and then you would have not your problem, but our problem. We'd solve that. And then you'd go back to the office and you'd sit around and talk about it. And if you were brand new, how would you learn? You would be baptized into this group through the stories that they would tell. That when you would bring something up, you would tell a story and you would tell a story. And the way that you learned things was not by going in the classroom. There was some technical things you had to learn in the classroom. But the way that you learned to participate in the practice was through the stories that people would tell. So, I've got 2 minutes then to offer you a prototype of a possible way that we might address this one church's problem. And it's in the language of human-centered design, they talk about how might we. Is that a phrase you guys know? How might we? They say that all the time. So, how might we recalibrate small groups to enact worship, discipleship, community, and vocation for the smartphone generation? Well, I've got a process first. I've got a partner church, a church in the East Coast that has come to me and said, we have this problem. What are we going to do? And so I'm going to propose a prototype. And what they're going to do is the guy in charge of small groups is not going to get any permission from anybody. He's not going to talked through it with, all the bosses yet. He's just simply going to get his one boss to say, I'm going to do this, okay. He's going to run 4 groups. 2 of them are traditional groups that are going to be unchanged from anything they've been doing already. And 2 of them are going to be recalibrated in a way I'll describe in a minute. But then we'll do assessment before and after. Do you know the phrase, what gets measured gets done? And what we're going to measure is we're going to measure worship by asking, do the people in the small groups use Christian categories to narrate their week? We're going to measure discipleship by asking, are they learning new Christian concepts? We're going to measure community by asking about mutual accountability. And we're going to measure vocation to see if the people in their, actually in their workplace, they start to see them as the people entrusted to their care. So what are we going to do? We're going to offer a prototype where it starts out with an opening retreat. The reason we're going to start with an opening retreat is that we know that from online education that people build community online once they have met each other face to face. We'll have content delivered to them daily via their smartphone so that they can experience the content delivery and that kind of stuff that would come in a small group setting, that would come in their workplace. And it would actually relate to things that their small group leader and others have been listening to them that they know are issues from their workplace. And then it would include things like face-to-face prayer and reflections. And so what we would do is gather those folks and we'd say, the people that are in the small group, you're going to be paired with 2 or 3 other people. And either you're going to meet face-to-face, like in a happy hour or something, with another person once a week, or you're going to agree to meet via Skype where you're seeing them their face, but you're on FaceTime or Skype, you're going to do that twice a week. And part of what we're going to do is, because this particular church is in a very large metropolitan area and is in a downtown setting, there's a lot of the people that work in large office buildings downtown. They're actually going to be in physical proximity to each other enough that they can meet for happy hour once a week after church or after work and pray for each other and talk about their lives. But we're going to try to do this in a way that creates a smartphone-based discipleship experience. Now, there's a lot more to that. I just covered it in 2 minutes. We're going to it would take me 20 minutes to talk through all of it. But the point is, we're going to prototype it, and then we're going to try it, and we're going to measure the results, and then we're going to fix it. Because I guarantee you, the first time that we do it, there will be pieces of it that will crash and burn. Okay. But we're not going to build a grandstand, and we're not going to say, come and see. What we're going to do is we're going to try some stuff, and we're going to learn from it, and we're going to keep iterating on it. And the thing that scares my friend that's going to implement this, the thing that scares him the most is that we're not going to get it right the first time, and that we're going to have to do iterations, and that he's worried that someone in his congregation is going to find out, and they will cut out the experiments too quickly. He says, can we do this like in 2 cycles? Is that enough? He's really worried about all the different change work. That's what he's worried about, because experimentation is so scary to him because of his church. Now, I just zipped through the last 20 minutes in 5 minutes. So we are over time. Should I just simply call it to an end at this point?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good, and then you can.
Thank you very much. If you have more questions, come and see me.
Thank yous from online. They really appreciate it.
I would love it if you had comments for me. And so if you have thoughts about this, both good and bad, my email address is the world's easiest email address. It's my last name, Cormode, @fuller.edu. I would love to hear from you. I really am serious about it. I'm going to be revising based on any kind of feedback I could get.